Imagine standing at the edge of the Sahara Desert, the sun barely cresting the horizon, and before you, rising out of the sand with an impossible, almost aggressive perfection, stands the Great Pyramid of Giza. You have seen pictures of it your entire life. You thought you understood it. You thought humanity understood it. But what if everything you were ever told about why these structures were built is wrong? What if the real answer has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, buried not under sand but under assumptions? What if the pyramid was never a tomb at all, and the civilization that built it was trying to send a message so important, so urgent, that they encoded it in millions of tons of stone, trusting that someday, someone would finally be able to read it? That moment may have arrived. Because right now, in laboratories in Cairo, in university offices in Boston and Prague and Tokyo, and in the desert itself, researchers are assembling a picture so different from the textbook version that when it finally becomes mainstream, it will shake the foundations of how we understand human history. This is not a fringe theory. This is not the stuff of late-night documentaries with dramatic music and shaky camera work. This is the convergence of archaeology, astrophysics, geology, material science, and ancient linguistics arriving at the same extraordinary conclusion from completely different directions. And once you see it, once the pieces lock into place, you cannot unsee it. So stay with me. Because by the end of what I am about to share with you, the pyramids will never look the same again. Let us begin where every honest investigation must begin, with what we actually know, and more importantly, with what we have pretended to know for far longer than we should have. The standard story goes something like this. Around 4,500 years ago, an Egyptian pharaoh named Khufu decided he wanted a monument to mark his greatness and serve as his tomb after death. He assembled a workforce. The old story said slaves, though we now know they were paid laborers. And over the course of roughly 20 years, they somehow managed to quarry, transport, and precisely position approximately 2.5 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. Some weighing as much as 80 tons, into a structure that stands 147 meters tall, covers over 13 acres of ground, and is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of 1 degree. Then Khufu died, was buried inside, and that was that. The pyramid served its purpose. End of story, except it is not the end of the story. It is barely even the beginning. Because the moment you start pulling on the threads of this narrative, the whole thing unravels at a speed that is almost embarrassing, and the threads start pulling themselves. Thread number 1. Khufu's body was never found inside the Great Pyramid. Not a fragment of bone, not a scrap of linen wrapping, not a single canopic jar. The so-called King's Chamber contains a granite sarcophagus that has no lid, shows no signs of ever having been sealed, and is positioned in a way that would have made it extraordinarily difficult to bring a mummy, or anything much larger than a person, through the narrow passages leading to it. Egyptian pharaohs were buried with staggering quantities of grave goods, jewelry, furniture, food, weapons, servants' effigies, model boats, shabtis by the hundreds. The Great Pyramid contained essentially none of this when it was first documented. The chambers were empty. The passages were open. There was no evidence of the elaborate ritual sealing process that characterized every other royal tomb we have ever found in Egypt. Now, defenders of the tomb theory will tell you that the pyramid was robbed in antiquity. Grave robbers, they say, stripped it clean thousands of years ago. This is the explanation that has been handed down through textbooks for generations, and on the surface it sounds reasonable. But when you examine it carefully, it starts to collapse, because we have found royal tombs in Egypt that were robbed in antiquity. The Valley of the Kings is full of them, And even in those thoroughly plundered tombs, there are always traces, fragments of gold leaf, broken pieces of ceremonial objects, hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls describing the life of the deceased, canopic jars smashed but still present in part. The robbers took what they could carry, but they could not uninscribe the walls. They could not remove the fundamental character of the space. Yet the Great Pyramid's interior passages and chambers are, with the exception of a few markings discovered relatively recently, almost entirely devoid of the visual language that defines Egyptian royal burial. There are no spells from the Book of the Dead. There are no images of Osiris weighing the heart of the pharaoh against the feather of Mad. There is none of the cosmological narrative that the Egyptians considered absolutely essential for guiding the soul of a dead king through the afterlife. If this was a tomb, it is the most untomb-like tomb in the history of Egyptian civilization. And that is just the first thread. Thread number 2 concerns the alignment. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north, not magnetic north, but the actual rotational axis of the Earth, with an accuracy that was not surpassed by any human construction until the 20th century. The Paris Observatory, one of the most precisely engineered buildings in Europe when it was completed in the 1600, is not as accurately aligned to true north as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Think about that for a moment. A structure built 4,500 years ago, using tools of copper and wood and stone, in a desert without GPS or laser theodolites or satellite reference systems, is more accurately pointed at the North Pole than a 17th-century European observatory built specifically to study the heavens with the best instruments of its day. How? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. We have theories. Some researchers suggest the ancient Egyptians may have used a method involving the circumpolar stars, stars that never set below the horizon and rotate around Polaris, to establish true north with remarkable precision. This is plausible, but even if we accept that explanation for the directional alignment, it only raises a deeper question. Why did they care so much? Why would a tomb, a structure whose primary purpose was, we are told, to house the body and spirit of a dead king, need to be aligned to true north with a precision that would impress a modern engineer? Tombs do not need to be aligned to true north. Tombs need to be dark and dry and sealed. The obsessive astronomical precision of the Great Pyramid suggests a function that goes beyond simply keeping a mummy safe. Thread number 3 is the shafts. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are 4 narrow passages, 2 from the king's chamber and 2 from the queen's chamber, that angle upward through the body of the pyramid at precise inclinations. For a long time, these were called air shafts, and the explanation was reassuringly mundane. They were ventilation channels, installed to allow workers to breathe while working in the deep interior chambers. The problem with this explanation is that the 2 shafts from the queen's chamber did not open onto the outside of the pyramid until modern workers cleared them in the 1800s. They terminated inside the body of the pyramid, sealed by stone doors. Ventilation shafts that do not connect to fresh air are not ventilation shafts. They are something else. In 1964, a researcher named Virginia Trimble and an engineer named Alexander Badoy made a discovery that reframed these shafts entirely. They calculated the angles of the king's chamber shafts and found that around 2500 BCE, the approximate construction date of the pyramid, these shafts pointed at specific stars. The northern shaft of the king's chamber pointed at Thuban, the pole star of that era, a star that the ancient Egyptians associated with immortality because it never moved from its fixed position in the heavens. The southern shaft pointed at Orion's belt, or more specifically, at the three stars the Egyptians called the Jewet, which they associated with the god Osiris and with the realm of the dead and resurrection. Later analysis of the queen's chamber shafts showed they pointed at Kachab in the north, another star associated with eternal life, and at Sirius in the south, the star the Egyptians identified with the goddess Isis, consort of Osiris. The pyramid was not just a line to the cardinal directions. It was a three-dimensional star map. Its shafts were not for ventilation. They were for connection, for sight lines, for creating a geometric link between the stone interior of the building and specific, carefully chosen points in the night sky. Whatever was happening inside the Great Pyramid, it was deeply, deliberately, astronomically connected to the stars. This brings us to the Orion correlation theory, one of the most controversial and yet stubbornly compelling hypotheses in alternative Egyptology. In 1994, Robert Bovell and Adrian Gilbert published a book proposing that the three pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the smaller Pyramid of Menkaure, are arranged on the ground to match the three stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the Egyptian sky around 10,500 BCE. The two large pyramids align almost perfectly. The smaller one is offset to the left by a degree that matches the fainter third star of the belt. Bovell also noted that the Nile River, flowing to the east of the plateau, corresponds to the Milky Way in the same celestial map, the real river mirroring the River of Stars. The date of 10,500 BCE is what makes this theory both extraordinary and explosive, because if the pyramids were designed to reflect the sky as it looked 12,500 years ago, then either the design originated at that much earlier date, implying a civilization sophisticated enough to understand precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of stars to shift over millennia, or the builders were working from records and traditions that stretched back to that era. Either possibility demolishes the conventional timeline of human civilization, which holds that no complex societies existed before roughly 5000 BCE, and that writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture emerged no earlier than around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mainstream archaeology has largely rejected the Orion correlation theory, and the rejection is not unreasonable. The match between the pyramids and the belt stars is imperfect, and there are statistical questions about how easy it would be to find star patterns matching almost any arrangement of 3 points. But dismissal is not the same as refutation, and the broader pattern of astronomical precision at Giza, the alignment, the shafts, the layout, remains unexplained by the tomb hypothesis. You can argue about which stars the shafts point at and what they mean. You cannot argue that those shafts were randomly angled. Now let us add another layer to this. Let us talk about the physical structure itself, because the engineering of the Great Pyramid is perhaps the single most understated miracle in the history of human construction. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.5 million individual stone blocks. The average weight of these blocks is around 2.5 tons, though the blocks vary enormously, with the granite blocks in the king's chamber ceiling weighing between 40 and 70 tons each. The entire structure weighs approximately 6 million tons. It was built, according to conventional chronology, over a period of roughly 20 years, which means the workers would have needed to quarry, transport, shape, and place one block every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 2 decades straight. Even if they only worked 10 hours a day, the math compresses to placing one block every minute or so, which is almost impossible to imagine with the tools and methods most scholars have proposed. The precision of the construction is equally staggering. The base of the Great Pyramid is level 2 within 2 centimeters across its entire 230-meter span. 2 centimeters. That is less than the width of a finger across a football field. The corner angles of the base are accurate to within a fraction of a degree of perfect 90-degree angles. The facing stones that originally covered the pyramid, a gleaming white limestone casing that would have made it visible for dozens of kilometers across the desert, shining like a beacon in the sunlight, were fitted together so tightly that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. The stone blocks were not just placed, they were machined. Their surfaces were ground flat to tolerances that would be impressive with modern equipment, and they were fitted edge to edge with almost no mortar at all, relying instead on the precision of the fit itself to hold them in place. How was this achieved? This is the question that has consumed engineers, architects, and historians for centuries, and the honest answer is that nobody is entirely sure. We have theories. We have experimental archaeology, teams of volunteers with replica tools attempting to move and shape large blocks of stone. We have ramps and sleds, and wetting agents and organizational models. What we do not have is a definitive explanation that accounts for every aspect of what we see at Giza, including the speed of construction, the precision of the fitting, and the sourcing of specific types of stone, including granite from Aswan, 500 miles south of Giza, that would have required enormous logistical operations to move. Here is something most people do not realize. We have found evidence of the workers who built the pyramids. We have their villages, their bakeries, their breweries, their medical facilities. We know they ate well beef, fish, bread, beer in quantities that suggest a well-fed and presumably willing workforce. We have administrative records that show the workers were organized into gangs with names, given days off, and treated as an important national labor force. This is genuinely wonderful evidence that rewrites the old narrative of slavery and suffering. But what we do not have, not in anywhere near the quantity we would expect, is contemporary written documentation of why the pyramids were built, detailed records of the construction process, or any kind of ancient Egyptian source text that says straightforwardly, in so many words, that Khufu built the Great Pyramid as his tomb. The primary ancient textual evidence for Khufu's ownership of the Great Pyramid is a cartouche, a hieroglyphic oval containing a name, found in a relieving chamber above the king's chamber by Howard Vyse in 1837. This chamber, one of 5 narrow spaces stacked above the king's chamber that were apparently designed to distribute the enormous weight of the stone above and prevent the ceiling from collapsing, was first entered by Vyse using explosives. The cartouche reads Khufu, and from this single piece of evidence, combined with ancient Greek accounts and some later Egyptian texts, the entire attribution of the pyramid to Khufu rests. The problem is that Howard Vyse was under enormous professional pressure to make a significant discovery at Giza and had a known history of embellishment. Multiple researchers over the decades have raised questions about the cartouche, noting apparent errors in the hieroglyphic spelling that would be unusual for ancient Egyptian scribes, but consistent with someone working from an imperfect reference text. This does not prove the cartouche is a forgery. It might simply reflect an unusual scribal convention. But it does mean that the foundational piece of evidence attributing the pyramid to Khufu is contested, and that the attribution itself may be built on shakier ground than the pyramid's foundations. What if we set aside the question of who built the pyramid and focus instead on a more fundamental and more interesting question? What was it for? This is where the investigation takes a turn that is, I think, genuinely thrilling. Because in the last 2 decades, A convergence of new discoveries and new analytical methods has begun to produce a picture that is radically different from the tomb hypothesis. And that picture is not chaos or mystery. It is actually more coherent, more elegant, and in some ways more awe-inspiring than the conventional story. Let us start with what may be the most important discovery made at the pyramids in the modern era. In 2017, a team of researchers using a technique called muon tomography, which involves measuring the penetration of cosmic ray particles through solid matter, in a way that is roughly analogous to an X-ray but works on massive stone structures, announced they had discovered a previously unknown large void inside the Great Pyramid. This void, located above the Grand Gallery, the stunning corbelled passage that leads to the King's Chamber, is at least 30 meters long. It was completely unknown to archaeologists before this discovery. Nobody had entered it in modern times. Nobody knew it was there. A void 30 meters long inside the Great Pyramid. A hidden chamber, think about that. The most studied, most visited, most analyzed structure in the history of human civilization, and it still has rooms we have never seen. The question is not just what is in that void. The question is why it is there, what it was used for, and whether there are others. The muon tomography project, called Scan Pyramids, is ongoing, and its early results suggest the interior of the Great Pyramid is considerably more complex than the simplified diagrams in textbooks imply. There may be more passages, more chambers, more hidden spaces. The pyramid may be, in a sense, far more than we have been looking at. Now let us connect this to another thread, one that has been developing for decades in the fringes of Egyptological debate, but is increasingly supported by hard evidence. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with a concept called mad. This is usually translated as truth or justice or cosmic order, but none of these English words fully captures what Ma'at meant to the Egyptians. Ma'at was the underlying principle that held the universe together, the correct relationship between all things, the harmony between the human world and the divine world, the proper functioning of natural cycles. The pharaoh's primary ritual obligation was to maintain Ma'at. Every morning, the pharaoh performed ceremonies that were understood, not metaphorically but literally, as the act of keeping the sun rising, keeping the Nile flooding, keeping the stars in their courses, keeping reality from dissolving into chaos, which the Egyptians called Isfet. This is not primitive superstition. This is an extremely sophisticated cosmological philosophy embedded in a ritual practice. The Egyptians believed that the physical world and the divine world were not separate, that they interpenetrated, that actions in one sphere had consequences in the other, and that the structures and ceremonies of the royal court were not merely symbolic, but were functional mechanisms for maintaining the order of existence. The pyramid, in this context, is not a monument to ego or a container for a dead body. It is a machine for maintaining cosmic order. Several serious researchers have explored this idea in depth, and their work leads to a fascinating and radical proposition. What if the pyramid was not a tomb but a temple of resurrection, not just for the pharaoh, but for the sun itself? Consider the solar symbolism that pervades everything the Egyptians did. The pharaoh was not merely associated with the sun god Ra. He was understood to be a manifestation of Ra, and after death, he was understood to merge with Osiris in the underworld, and then be reborn with the rising sun each morning. The pyramid, with its perfect triangular form pointing up toward the sky, with its original gleaming white casing reflecting the sun's rays so brilliantly that it would have been visible from the Sinai Peninsula on a clear day, is a solar structure. The pyramid shape itself, the Benben, as it was called, was the primordial mound from which, According to Egyptian cosmology, the first sunrise occurred when the sun's rays struck the pyramidion, the capstone. It would have created the effect of the sun touching earth, of heaven and earth joined in a blazing point of light. The pyramid was not hiding the pharaoh from the sun. It was connecting the pharaoh to the sun. And the orientation matters here too. The causeway leading from the Sphinx up to the pyramid complex is aligned so that if you stand at the Sphinx and look toward the pyramid on the spring equinox, you see the sun setting directly between the two large pyramids, as though the pyramid were a gateway through which the sun passes. This is not an accident. The ancient Egyptians did not do accidental things in stone that weighed millions of tons. But let us go deeper, because the solar and stellar connections, as extraordinary as they are, may themselves be pointing at something even more profound, a function of the pyramid that is stranger and more surprising than anything we have discussed so far. In 2018, a paper published in the journal Applied Physics A peer-reviewed scientific publication, not a fringe outlet, reported the results of a computational electromagnetic analysis of the Great Pyramid. A team of physicists from ITMO University in Russia and the Laser Zentrum Hanover in Germany modeled how the pyramid would interact with radio waves with wavelengths between 200 and 600 meters, which is in the range of wavelengths produced by certain atmospheric and electromagnetic phenomena. What they found was remarkable. The Great Pyramid does not simply block or absorb these wavelengths. It concentrates electromagnetic energy in specific chambers inside the structure, specifically in the burial chambers and in the base, and it directs some of this energy downward into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. The researchers were not making mystical claims. They were publishing a physics paper about electromagnetic resonance in a geometrically complex structure. But the implications are extraordinary. The Great Pyramid is not electromagnetically passive. It is electromagnetically active. It concentrates and directs certain wavelengths of electromagnetic energy. It behaves, in a very technical sense, like an antenna or a resonant cavity. Now, mainstream archaeologists will rightly point out that this says nothing about the intent of the pyramid's builders. The Egyptians may not have been aware of this property, and the electromagnetic behavior may be an incidental result of the pyramid's shape and materials. This is fair, but it is not the only evidence of acoustic and energetic properties being deliberately built into the pyramid. Researchers studying the acoustic properties of the king's chamber have found something that should not be there. The chamber is made of solid red granite, one of the acoustically least resonant materials available, granite being dense and non-porous. Yet the king's chamber produces an extraordinarily rich acoustic environment. The room has a resonant frequency of approximately 438 Hz, extremely close to the note A4 in modern concert pitch, and it produces a reverberation time of several seconds, meaning sounds decay slowly and sustain richly. The lidless granite sarcophagus in the chamber resonates at a slightly different frequency that harmonizes with the room. The sarcophagus was not a coffin waiting to be filled. It was, acoustically, an instrument. It was tuned. Some acoustic researchers have gone further, suggesting that the entire interior of the Great Pyramid may function as a series of coupled resonant chambers, with different spaces tuned to different frequencies that would interact to produce complex and powerful acoustic effects. This is speculative, but it is speculative in a direction that makes engineering sense given the evidence. Cultures around the world have long understood that certain acoustic environments produce altered states of consciousness. This is one reason why churches, temples, and mosques are designed with specific resonance properties. The Greeks designed their theaters with astonishing acoustic precision. The creators of Stonehenge may have been interested in the sound effects produced by stone circles as much as in their astronomical alignments. The idea that the ancient Egyptians might have deliberately created acoustic environments inside the pyramid is entirely consistent with what we know about human use of sound and sacred space throughout history. And here is where a radically different theory begins to crystallize. Not from mysticism, not from wishful thinking, but from a convergence of physical evidence and historical context. What if the Great Pyramid was built as a center of initiation? A place where individuals selected by the pharaoh and the priesthood underwent a specific, carefully designed experience intended to transform their consciousness, their understanding of the cosmos, and their relationship to the divine order. This idea has been circulating in various forms for a very long time. It appears in the writings of certain ancient Greek authors, including some who claim to have undergone initiatory experiences in Egypt. It has been advocated by everyone from Herodotus to Pythagoras, both of whom reportedly spent time in Egypt and came away transformed. It has been proposed by modern researchers including John Anthony West, the late scholar who spent decades arguing that Egyptian civilization was far older and more sophisticated than the conventional timeline admits, and Graham Hancock, whose books and lectures on ancient civilizations have introduced millions of people to these questions. But for a long time, this idea existed outside mainstream scholarship, associated with esotericism rather than science. What is changing now is that the physical evidence, the electromagnetic resonance, the acoustic tuning, the astronomical alignments, the hidden chambers, is making this hypothesis harder to dismiss. Because if you wanted to design a structure for this kind of purpose, the design choices you would make are strikingly similar to the design choices we observe at Giza. You would want astronomical alignment so that at specific, ritually important times of year, the equinoxes, the solstices, the heliacal rising of Sirius, the play of light and shadow inside the structure would create dramatic and specific effects. The Great Pyramid delivers this. You would want acoustic properties that would amplify and sustain sound, chanting, drumming, intoned vowel sounds, to produce the kind of sustained resonance that researchers in the psychology of altered states have identified as a reliable trigger for deep meditative and visionary experiences. The Great Pyramid delivers this. You would want complete darkness and total enclosure, because sensory deprivation of the visual sense dramatically amplifies all other senses, including proprioception and the internal sense of time and space. The interior of the pyramid, with no windows and with passages designed to route light in specific directions, delivers this. You would want the initiatory experience to be framed within a cosmological narrative of death and rebirth, so that the psychological journey the initiate undergoes inside the structure maps onto a story that gives it meaning and context. The Egyptian religious system, with its Assyrian mythology of death, dismemberment, resurrection, and apotheoses, provides exactly this framework, and you would want the structure itself to be monumentally impressive, to be so visually overwhelming in its scale and perfection that the experience of entering it would already have begun to shift the initiate's ordinary state of consciousness before they descended a single passage. The Great Pyramid, visible from 50 miles away, sheathed in polished white limestone that turned it into a literal beacon, absolutely delivers this. This theory, let us call it the initiation temple hypothesis, does not contradict everything we know about ancient Egypt. In fact, it fits the available evidence arguably better than the tomb hypothesis does. The ancient Egyptians were deeply preoccupied with the transformation of consciousness and with the journey of the soul. Their mystery schools, their ritual practices, Their cosmological texts all center on a single theme: the possibility of transformation, of moving from a lower to a higher state of being, of aligning the individual self with the cosmic order. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He was a mediator between the human and divine worlds, and his primary function was to maintain that mediation through constant ritual practice. The pyramid in this reading is not a monument to his death. It is a monument to his function, and to the function of the initiated priesthood and selected royal candidates who trained within it. There is a beautiful piece of textual evidence that supports this reading, though it is rarely discussed in this context. The pyramid texts, a collection of funerary spells inscribed on the walls of later Old Kingdom pyramids, dating to around 2350 BCE, contain passages that describe the ascending journey of the deceased king through a series of gates, trials, and transformations toward ultimate union with the divine. Scholars have long read these as instructions for the afterlife journey of a literal dead person, but several researchers have noted that the structure of the pyramid texts maps almost perfectly onto the interior passages of the Great Pyramid, as if the texts were describing not a metaphysical journey after death, but a physical journey through the pyramid while alive. The ascending passages, the grand gallery, the antechamber with its granite portcullis stones that had to be navigated past, the king's chamber, each corresponds to a phase of the journey described in the texts. The initiate physically enacted the mythological journey. The pyramid was the script and the stage simultaneously. If this sounds too neat, too speculative, consider that we actually have direct parallels from other ancient cultures for this kind of practice. The ancient Greeks had mystery schools at Eleusis where initiates underwent multi-day transformative experiences that ancient sources consistently describe as involving a kind of simulated death and rebirth. The details of the Eleusinian mysteries were kept secret on pain of death for nearly 2,000 years. We know they involved fasting, a procession, something dramatic seen in the inner sanctum, and a total transformation of the initiate's relationship to death and the divine. We know that virtually every major Greek philosopher and political leader of the classical period, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Sophocles, Pindar, Marcus Aurelius, was initiated at Eleusis and spoke of the experience as the most important of his life. We simply do not know the specific content of what happened, but we know that mystery school initiation was a real, serious, transformative practice, not metaphorical, not symbolic, but experiential, and that Egypt was universally regarded in the ancient world as the origin and the master of these practices. Plato, in his dialogues, repeatedly references Egypt as the source of mathematical, astronomical, and philosophical wisdom. When he describes the ideal state in the Republic, it is modeled on what Egyptian observers reported about Egyptian priestly organization. When Pythagoras, the mathematician and philosopher who founded the first known Western philosophical school, returned from his reported decades of study in Egypt, he brought back a synthesis of mathematics, music theory, astronomy, and metaphysical cosmology that became the foundation of Western intellectual tradition. The idea that Greek philosophy and science emerged from Egypt is not romanticization. It is what the Greeks themselves consistently reported, and it makes considerably more sense if Egypt's temples and pyramids were centers of active intellectual and initiatory practice, rather than mere burial grounds. Let us now move to another dimension of the question, one that is both more recent and more technical, and that is changing the conversation in a way that cannot be attributed to speculation or wishful thinking. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Pierre Tollet of the Sorbonne made an astounding discovery in a cave at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, roughly 100 miles south of Suez. They found a collection of papyrus documents that are the oldest papyri ever discovered, dated to the reign of Khufu himself, around 2560 BCE. These are contemporaneous records, written while the Great Pyramid was being built. They include the diary of an official named Murr, who oversaw a team of workers and boats involved in transporting limestone blocks from quarries at Tura, on the opposite bank of the Nile, to Giza. The diary contains detailed records of the logistics: when the boats left, when they arrived, what they were carrying, how many men were on each crew, what the weather was like. This is an extraordinary discovery. It is the closest thing we have to a first-person, contemporaneous account of pyramid construction, and it confirms many aspects of the conventional narrative: the labor organization, the transportation methods, the administrative sophistication. But it also raises a question that is not often discussed. The diary records the transportation of casing stones, the fine white Tura limestone that was used for the outer facing. It does not discuss the interior chambers. It does not discuss the purpose of what is being built. Murr was a transportation official. He moved stones from here to there. He did not know or did not record the function of the structure he was helping to build. This is significant because in the kind of compartmentalized, hierarchical society that ancient Egypt clearly was, the workers who quarried the stone did not necessarily know what the stone was for. The builders who assembled the blocks did not necessarily understand the astronomical or initiatory purpose of the structure they were building. The priests who used the completed pyramid would have been a small and very different group from the labor force that constructed it. This kind of institutional compartmentalization is actually extremely common in the history of monumental religious construction. The people who built the great Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe were skilled workers, masons, and carpenters. They were not theologians. They followed the plans of architects who were themselves guided by religious requirements they may not have fully understood. The function of the building was determined at a level above the construction process. Now let us consider the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza, the enormous limestone figure of a lion with a human head that crouches on the plateau to the east of the pyramids, is in many ways even more mysterious than the pyramids themselves. And here, the geological evidence has produced a discovery so significant that it amounts to a fundamental challenge to the entire chronology of ancient Egypt. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch, a professor at Boston University with a specialty in stratigraphy and the weathering of stone, was invited to examine the Sphinx by John Anthony West. What Schoch found, and has since defended in peer-reviewed geological literature, is that the weathering pattern on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure is not consistent with wind and sand erosion. It is consistent with water erosion. Specifically, it shows the deep, rounded, vertical erosion channels that are produced by prolonged heavy rainfall over many centuries. This is a problem because the last time the Giza Plateau experienced prolonged heavy rainfall was not in 2500 BCE. It was in the period between roughly 10,000 and 5000 BCE, when North Africa was in the middle of what climatologists call the African humid period or the Green Sahara, a climatic phase when the Sahara was significantly wetter than it is today, with rivers, lakes, and substantially higher annual rainfall. If the weathering on the Sphinx was produced by this rainfall, and the geological signatures are very specific and not easily explained by any other mechanism, then the Sphinx was already standing when this rain was falling, which means the Sphinx is at least 7,000 years old, and possibly older than 10,000 years. This is not the consensus position of Egyptology. Most Egyptologists reject Scott's conclusion, arguing that the weathering could have been produced by other mechanisms, periodic flooding, condensation, dew, without requiring a much older construction date. But the geological argument has never been fully refuted. Scott's analysis has been reviewed by geologists who are not associated with the alternative history community, and while the interpretation is contested, the observation that the weathering pattern on the Sphinx is anomalous and requires explanation is not seriously disputed. Something produced those weathering patterns. The question is what? If Scott is right, and he has been careful and methodical in his argument for 30 years, then the Sphinx was built by a culture that existed before the civilization conventionally known as ancient Egypt. This does not mean aliens or Atlantis, though those are the labels that get attached to the argument in the popular press. It means that there was a sophisticated human culture in northeastern Africa earlier than our current models predict. A culture capable of organizing the labor and applying the technical knowledge needed to carve an enormous figure from bedrock. This would not be entirely without precedent. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, discovered in the 1990 and dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, is a complex of sophisticated stone monuments built by a culture that had no pottery and may not have had agriculture. The capacity for monumental construction clearly preceded what we thought was the necessary social and technological prerequisite. The implications for the pyramids are obvious. If the Sphinx is older than the conventional chronology allows, then the culture that built the Sphinx, whatever it was, may have been far more advanced than any civilization we currently recognize in that period. And the pyramids, which sit on the same plateau and share deep structural and cultural relationships with the Sphinx and its accompanying temples, may be part of the same cultural project. A project that spans a much longer period of time than the textbooks acknowledge. Now I want to bring something in that is rarely discussed in this context, but that I think is perhaps the most philosophically profound thread of all. It concerns what the ancient Egyptians themselves said about the origins of their civilization. The ancient Egyptians had a concept they called Zep-Tepi, which translates roughly as the first time. A mythological golden age at the very beginning of history, when the gods walked the earth, when civilization was established by divine or semi-divine beings, and when all the fundamental arts of civilization, writing, astronomy, architecture, medicine, agriculture, law were first taught to humanity. The priests of Heliopolis, the great theological center of ancient Egypt, maintained that their temple had been established in the first time, and that the knowledge preserved within it descended unbroken from that primordial era. This is, on one level, classic mythological origin narrative. Every civilization has foundation myths. But what is unusual about the Egyptian version is its extraordinary specificity and its consistency across thousands of years of documentation. The Egyptians did not just say the gods taught them things. They preserved, in remarkable detail, astronomical and mathematical knowledge that was clearly of enormous antiquity, that encoded information about the stars and the cycles of time in ways that only make full sense if the original observations were made much earlier than the conventional origin date of Egyptian civilization. The Dendera zodiac, a famous star map carved in a ceiling relief in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, depicts the precession of the equinoxes in a way that, if read correctly, marks the zodiacal age in which the original astronomical observation was made. The age indicated is the age of Leo, which corresponds to the period between approximately 970 and 8,810 BCE. And the Sphinx, as multiple researchers have noted, is a leonine figure with a human head, facing due east toward the rising sun on the spring equinox. At the time of the age of Leo, the spring equinox sunrise would have occurred with the constellation Leo rising on the horizon directly behind the Sphinx's gaze. The Sphinx was a celestial marker, a pointer to a specific moment in astronomical time, a time roughly contemporaneous with the weathering patterns on its body. This convergence, the geological weathering, the astronomical encoding, the mythological memory of a first time, the pyramid text's description of a journey that maps onto the pyramid's interior, all of it points in the same direction. There was something happening on the Giza Plateau, and in Egypt more broadly, that began much earlier than we have been taught, that was carried forward by a tradition of extraordinary continuity and purpose, and that the construction of the pyramids represents not the beginning of that tradition, but a culmination of it. A monument built to encode and preserve, in permanent, unambiguous stone, the most important knowledge that tradition had accumulated over thousands of years. What was that knowledge? This is where we arrive at what I believe is the most important and most underappreciated answer to the question of why the pyramids were built. Not the only answer. These structures served multiple purposes simultaneously, as great monuments usually do. But the answer that, in my reading of the evidence, best explains the totality of what we see. The Great Pyramid was built to last. Not to last 50 years, or 500 years, or 5,000 years. To last indefinitely. The choice of materials, granite that does not decay, limestone casing that would have survived millennia. The choice of construction method, the sheer scale of the enterprise, all speak to a determination to create something permanent in a way that no other structure in human history has matched. The Egyptians had many options for building a tomb that would last a long time. A simple sealed rock-cut tomb, like those in the Valley of the Kings, can last tens of thousands of years. A mud brick mastaba with a stone sarcophagus would serve the purpose of housing a body with no engineering challenges beyond those already mastered. The pyramid is a completely unnecessary level of effort and precision if all you want to do is keep a mummy dry. The pyramid is an unnecessary level of effort if your goal is practical. But if your goal is to encode information, if you want to transmit something to the future with the certainty that it will survive anything short of the literal dissolution of the planet, then the pyramid begins to make sense. Not as a document, not as a library, but as a message written not in words, which are fragile and language dependent, but in mathematics and geometry and astronomy, which are universal. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid encode an extraordinary range of mathematical constants. The base perimeter divided by twice the height gives a value extremely close to pi, 14,159. The ratio of the height to the base is extremely close to the golden ratio, phi, 1,618. The slope of the faces at 51.8 degrees is related to the same ratio. Whether these encodings are intentional or incidental is one of the great debates in the field. But the precision of the pyramid's construction is so extreme that if these ratios are present by accident, it is an accident of such unlikely precision as to require an explanation of its own. A structure randomly built to whatever dimension seemed convenient would not coincidentally encode both pi and phi in its proportions. The choice of dimensions was deliberate, and the question is what those deliberate dimensions were meant to communicate. Some researchers have taken this further, finding in the dimensions of the pyramid ratios related to the circumference of the Earth, the radius of the Earth, the speed of light, and other physical constants. The most famous of these claims that the height of the pyramid in meters multiplied by 1,000,000,000 equals approximately the average distance from the Earth to the Sun, is usually dismissed because the meter was not an ancient unit of measurement. But this objection actually misses the point. The pyramid's dimensions encode specific ratios, and those ratios have relationships to physical reality that would be expressible in any system of measurement. The Egyptians did not use meters. They used their own precisely defined units of measurement called royal cubits. When you express the pyramid's dimensions in royal cubits and examine the ratios, you get the same mathematical relationships, because the relationships are inherent in the geometry, not in any particular unit. The fact that those geometric ratios happen to correspond to fundamental physical constants, to the geometry of the Earth and of orbital motion, may or may not be intentional. But it is not nothing. The Earth-commensurate dimensions of the pyramid have been proposed as a key piece of evidence for a specific hypothesis, that the pyramid was designed as a geodetic monument, a physical encoding of the dimensions of the Earth, preserved in stone for future civilizations to find and measure. If a future civilization, or an alien civilization, or the survivors of a catastrophe that destroyed advanced knowledge, found the Great Pyramid and had the mathematical sophistication to measure it precisely, they would be able to derive from its dimensions an accurate model of the Earth's size and shape. The pyramid is a message about the Earth. It says, "Whoever built this knew the size of this planet, and they wanted you to know they knew." The geodetic hypothesis has been developed most rigorously by researchers like Livio Catullo Stecchini, a professor of ancient measurements, and later by researchers like David Ritchie and Graham Hancock. It is contested, as most revolutionary hypotheses are, but it is not without merit, and in combination with the astronomical alignments, the acoustic design, the initiatory architecture, and the geological antiquity of the surrounding monuments, it contributes to a picture of a civilization that was not merely burying its dead, but was engaged in a project of vast ambition, the creation of a permanent, universal archive of the most important knowledge it possessed. Think about what that means. Think about what it says about whoever was behind this project. They were not just building for themselves or for their immediate successors. They were building for us, for whoever would come thousands of years later, whoever would develop the mathematics and astronomy to read the message encoded in the stone. They were building across time. They were making a gift to the future, or perhaps, and this is the most haunting possibility, they were making a warning, because the Egyptians' preoccupation with cycles of time was not purely abstract or ceremonial. Their cosmological texts include the concept of periodic catastrophe, great catastrophes that end ages of civilization, and from which only remnants survive. The texts of ancient Egypt, of ancient Sumer, of ancient India, of the Maya and the Hopi and dozens of other traditions around the world independently describe floods and fires and cosmic upheavals that periodically reset civilization. Modern geology and climatology are increasingly confirming that such catastrophes have indeed occurred in the human past, that approximately 12,800 years ago, there was a rapid global cooling event called the Younger Dryas, possibly triggered by a comet impact or airburst, that ended the last ice age catastrophically, causing massive flooding as ice sheets collapsed, triggering firestorms across the northern hemisphere, and bringing a near-extinction level disruption to whatever human cultures existed at the time. This event is now supported by impact evidence at dozens of sites across 3 continents, and it would have been experienced by any surviving humans as precisely the kind of world-ending catastrophe that shows up in flood myths from every part of the globe. If a sophisticated culture existed before the Younger Dryas, a culture capable of astronomical observation, geodetic measurement, and monumental construction, that culture was hit by a catastrophe that would have erased almost everything. The survivors would have been reduced to subsistence, carrying whatever knowledge they could in their heads, in oral tradition, perhaps in some fragile records. The project of rebuilding would have taken thousands of years. And when, finally, enough of the old knowledge had been reconstructed and enough social stability had been achieved, the imperative would have been to preserve it permanently, in a form that could not be burned or flooded or forgotten in stone. The pyramids on this reading are a post-catastrophe preservation project. They are the most important things that survived being lost once. They are the physical embodiment of a decision: never again. This is why the message is encoded in math rather than language. Language changes. The language spoken in Egypt 4,500 years ago is not intelligible to a modern Egyptian without years of specialized study. But pi is pi. The golden ratio is the golden ratio. The length of a solar year is the length of a solar year. Mathematical constants are the same in any language, at any point in history, on any planet. If you want to leave a message for a civilization you cannot predict, one that might speak any language, might have any cultural assumptions, but will definitely be able to do mathematics if it is advanced enough to read stone, you encode your message in mathematics. The builders of the pyramid knew this, and so they built a monument whose very proportions are a demonstration of mathematical knowledge, whose orientation is a demonstration of astronomical knowledge, whose interior is a demonstration of acoustic and architectural knowledge. The pyramid does not say these things in words, it says them by being what it is, by existing with the precision it exhibits. The message is the building itself, and the message is, we were here, we knew these things, we built this so you would find it and understand that we knew, and perhaps we were destroyed. Perhaps this, all of this precision, all of this beauty, all of this ambition was not enough to save us. We leave this for you so that it might be enough to save you if you are wise enough to read it. That is a haunting thought, and I think it is the right thought, because the alternative, that 2.5 million tons of precisely engineered stone, aligned to the stars, encoding mathematical constants, tuned acoustically, built on geological formations that suggest far greater antiquity than the official timeline admits, containing hidden chambers we are still discovering, was built just to store a body that was never found, strains credulity in a way that gets harder and harder to sustain the more carefully you look. Now let us talk about what is happening right now, because this is not a story about the past alone. It is a story about the present and the near future, and it is developing faster than most people realize. The Scan Pyramids project, which uses muon tomography, infrared thermography, and other non-invasive scanning technologies, is still active. The void discovered above the Grand Gallery in 2017 has not yet been entered or fully characterized. There are indications from the muon data that there may be additional uncharted spaces in the pyramid, and new scans with higher resolution detectors are being planned. Within the next decade, it is entirely plausible that we will have access to the interior of spaces inside the Great Pyramid that no human has entered for thousands of years, if ever. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri discovered in 2013 are still being studied and translated. New fragments continue to be analyzed, and the picture of Old Kingdom administrative life they reveal is continuously expanding. There may be additional papyri at other Red Sea sites that have not yet been excavated, and archaeological work in the region is ongoing. Egyptian antiquities authorities have in recent years become significantly more open to the use of advanced scanning and remote sensing technologies at Giza and other sites. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies in the bedrock beneath the Sphinx enclosure that have not been fully investigated. There is evidence, contested, but substantial enough to be taken seriously, of chambers or tunnels beneath the plateau that could date to a significantly earlier period than the known monuments. The geological work on the Sphinx weathering is also continuing. Scott and his colleagues have applied new dating techniques to samples from the Sphinx enclosure and have published results that continue to support an older construction date. A full resolution of this debate will require more data, but the available evidence is not going away. At the same time, the broader scientific context is shifting in ways that make the questions about pyramid construction and purpose more tractable. We now have far better understanding of the Younger Dryas impact event and its effects on human populations. We have a growing body of evidence for pre-agricultural cultural complexity, Göbekli Tepe being the most famous example, but not the only one. We have increasingly sophisticated geological and oceanographic data that can tell us what the climate and coastlines of the ancient world looked like, and when. All of this context bears on the question of what might have existed before the conventional dawn of civilization, and what traces of it might have survived. The question of why the pyramids were built is not a settled question. It has not been settled for the excellent reason that the available evidence does not support the conventional answer with anything approaching the confidence with which that answer is usually presented. We do not know why the pyramids were built. We know some of the facts about how they were built partially, imperfectly, and we know when they were built within a margin of several centuries. We do not know their purpose with certainty, and the more carefully and honestly we look at the evidence, the less certain the conventional tomb theory becomes. What we can say with confidence is this: the pyramids are among the most extraordinary achievements of any human civilization in any era. They are precisely engineered. They are astronomically aligned. They encode mathematical relationships. They have acoustic properties. They were built with a scale and permanence that suggests their creators intended them to last forever. They are associated with a civilization that had a sophisticated understanding of cosmology, mathematics, and the cycles of time, and that preserved in written and visual form the memory of a much earlier golden age from which their knowledge derived. And they sit in the midst of a landscape, the Giza Plateau, that continues to yield new discoveries, new anomalies, new evidence that what we have found so far is only a fraction of what is there. We are standing at the edge of something. The tools we have now, the scanning technologies, the genetic analysis, the isotopic dating, the computational modeling, are better than anything available to any previous generation of researchers. The willingness to ask hard questions, to take anomalies seriously rather than explaining them away, is greater than it has been in decades. And the evidence is accumulating at a rate that makes it increasingly hard to sustain the comfortable, reductive answer that the pyramids were built to house dead kings. Something much more interesting is happening. Something was being communicated. Something was being preserved. And we are finally, slowly, incrementally, through the accumulation of physics and geology and archaeology and astrophysics, beginning to learn how to read the message. I want to leave you with one final image. It is the image of a person, perhaps a priest, perhaps a pharaoh, perhaps an initiate from somewhere in the ancient world, walking for the first time through the narrow descending passage of the Great Pyramid in the darkness of a moonless night, carrying no light, feeling the stone walls on either side with their hands, the passage sloping downward and then leveling out, the air cool and utterly still, the silence so absolute that they could hear the blood moving through their own veins. They would have walked upward next, through the ascending passage, stooping under the low ceiling, until suddenly the walls opened up and they were standing in the grand gallery. A soaring corbelled corridor 47 meters long and 8.5 meters high, the stone slabs of the ceiling fitting together with impossible precision, the proportions designed to create a sense of expansion, of suddenly opening, of moving from constriction to vastness. Then through the antechamber, its massive granite portcullis stones sliding past them in the dark, and finally into the king's chamber itself, the granite room, the tuned room, the room where the lidless sarcophagus waited in the total dark, resonant and still. Imagine lying down in that sarcophagus in the darkness and the silence and the ancient resonant air. Imagine what your mind would do. Imagine what might open. Imagine what you might understand in that place at that moment that you had not understood before. The ancient Egyptians called the pyramid the horizon of Khufu, the place where the sun god touches the earth, where heaven and earth meet, where mortal and divine converge. Whatever it was built for, burial, initiation, commemoration, astronomical record, geodetic monument, message to the future, it was built to create an experience of the horizon, of standing on the edge of the known world and looking out toward everything beyond it. We are standing on that edge right now. The discoveries are coming, the picture is shifting, and sometime soon, perhaps within our lifetimes, perhaps in the next decade, perhaps when the sealed void above the grand gallery is finally opened, and the light of a modern torch falls for the first time in millennia on whatever is inside, the horizon that the ancient Egyptians pointed toward will come into view. Whatever is on the other side of that threshold, one thing is certain. The people who built the pyramids wanted us to find it. They designed these structures to survive until we were capable of understanding them. They built for us, across 4,000 years or 10,000 years or whatever the true span turns out to be. They trusted that we would eventually be curious enough, and humble enough and honest enough to look past the easy answer and pursue the real one. The question is whether we are. The evidence suggests that the answer, long thought to be buried in the past, is actually waiting for us in the future. We just have to be willing to walk into the dark passage and keep going. The pyramids are not a mystery that has been solved. They are a mystery that is finally, after millennia of looking at them and not truly seeing them, beginning to be understood. And that is not a cause for frustration at how much we do not know. It is a cause for extraordinary excitement about how much we are about to discover. The stone has been waiting. The message has been there all along. The horizon is closer than we think. And yet, even now, as we edge closer to the truth, there are forces, institutional, academic, political, that resist the revision. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the revision is too large. Because if we are right that the pyramids are older than the official timeline allows, and more purposeful, and more sophisticated, and more connected to a lost prehistory of human civilization than the textbook story admits, then the entire edifice of conventional ancient history needs to be rethought from the ground up. The careers built on the tomb hypothesis, the textbooks printed with its authority, the museum labels written in its confidence, all of it would need revision. And institutions like pyramids are built to resist change. But science is not institutions. Science is evidence and argument, and the argument is shifting. The evidence is accumulating, and the people doing the accumulating are no longer just the passionate outsiders and alternative thinkers who have been raising these questions for decades. They are now, increasingly, physicists at respected universities, geologists with peer-reviewed publication records, Egyptologists willing to push past the consensus, archaeologists using technologies that did not exist a generation ago. The question of why the pyramids were built is migrating from the fringe to the center of serious academic discourse, and that migration is the most exciting thing happening in the study of ancient history right now. Let us also take a moment to appreciate what this migration requires of us, not just as researchers, but as people. It requires intellectual humility. It requires the willingness to say, we were wrong, or at minimum, we were incomplete. It requires the courage to follow evidence into uncomfortable territory, to ask questions that challenge the narratives we grew up with, to treat anomalies as opportunities rather than threats. These are difficult things for individuals, and even more difficult for institutions. But they are the essential qualities of genuine inquiry. And the pyramids, whatever they ultimately turn out to be, have always rewarded genuine inquiry over comfortable assumption. Consider what it meant for a 19th century archaeologist to look at the precision of the pyramid's construction and conclude that it must have been built by thousands of slaves driven by a megalomaniacal pharaoh, because that was the only framework available. That framework was not evil. It was the product of its time, shaped by available knowledge and cultural assumptions. We should not condemn those scholars, but we should also recognize that our frameworks are products of our time, and that they will someday look as limited to the scholars of the future as those 19th century models look to us now. The humility to hold our current best understanding lightly, to believe it provisionally, to revise it when evidence demands, is the mark of a scientific civilization. And in engaging seriously with the mystery of the pyramids, we have an opportunity to practice that humility at the deepest level. Let me tell you about one more discovery that I have saved for this moment, because it crystallizes something essential about where all of this is heading. In 2022, researchers using ground-penetrating radar in the area surrounding the Great Pyramid discovered evidence of a large network of underground tunnels and chambers extending beneath the plateau. These findings have not yet been fully published or widely reported, and the Egyptian authorities have been cautious about making dramatic announcements before the data is fully analyzed. But among the researchers who have seen the preliminary results, there is a palpable sense that what lies beneath the Giza Plateau may be as significant as, or more significant than, what stands above it. Ancient sources, including the Roman author Pliny the Elder and the 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, describe underground galleries and chambers beneath the pyramids, used by the ancient priests to preserve records and sacred objects from floodwaters, and from what the sources mysteriously describe as fire from the sky. These accounts have long been dismissed as legend, but legends have a way of encoding real memories. The underground network at Giza, if the radar surveys are confirmed, would be exactly the kind of structure that the ancient accounts describe. It would be a repository, a library of stone, deeper and darker and more permanent than anything above ground, built by people who had seen civilization destroyed once and were determined to ensure that the essential knowledge survived into whatever came next. If there is a library beneath the pyramid, if there are chambers filled with records encoded in some durable medium, whether stone inscriptions or metal plates or some other archival form we have not anticipated, it would be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history, not by a small margin, by an enormous one. It would give us direct access to the thoughts and knowledge of a civilization that may predate our own by thousands of years, in its own words, on its own terms, unfiltered by the centuries of copying and reinterpretation and mistranslation that every other ancient text has passed through. This is the hope. This is why the question of why the pyramids were built is not a historical curiosity. It is an active frontier, with real consequences and real stakes. If the pyramids are what the tomb hypothesis says they are, then the investigation is essentially over. We understand them. We can continue refining the details, but there are no major revelations left. The story is complete. If, on the other hand, the pyramids are what the convergence of physical evidence and alternative scholarship suggests, a multi-purpose monument encoding the knowledge and memories of a lost civilization, designed to be found and read by whoever came after, then we are nowhere near the end of the investigation. We are at the beginning. The most important discoveries about the pyramids lie ahead of us, not behind. And that is exactly where the science is pointing. Not toward closure, toward opening. Toward the next passage, the next chamber, the next message written in stone by hands that reached across thousands of years to tap us on the shoulder and say, "Look more carefully. There is more here than you see. There has always been more." Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and spoke with the priests there, recorded something that the priests told him which has always struck me as remarkable. He wrote that the priests told him the history of Egypt extended back for an enormous span of time, far longer than any Greek would have thought possible, and that in all those thousands of years, there had been things accomplished that the modern world could not match and would not understand until it had developed sufficiently to do so. Herodotus himself was skeptical. He was a careful, critical thinker, not a credulous tourist, but he recorded what the priests said, and he took it seriously enough to include it in his history. The priests were not lying. The priests were curators of a tradition they themselves may not have fully understood, recipients of a legacy passed down from the first time, doing their best to preserve and transmit what had been given to them. They knew, at some level, that the knowledge they guarded was old beyond the reckoning of their contemporaries, and that it would only fully make sense to a civilization capable of reading the mathematics and the astronomy in which it was encoded. We may be that civilization. We are certainly closer to being that civilization than any generation that has come before us. We have the physics to understand electromagnetic resonance in stone structures. We have the astronomy to trace the precession of the equinoxes and calculate what the sky looked like 10,000 years ago. We have the geology to read weathering patterns and identify their causes. We have the computing power to model acoustic environments and electromagnetic fields. We have the scanning technologies to see through stone without touching it. What we have lacked, until recently, is the willingness to apply all of these tools to the pyramids without the constraint of the tomb hypothesis. We have been measuring the pyramids with one hand while holding back the implications of what we found with the other, because the implications were too destabilizing. That constraint is loosening. The implications are being faced. I said at the beginning that we are on the verge of a shocking discovery. That is true, but the most shocking discovery may not be a physical thing found in a hidden chamber, though that would certainly be extraordinary. The most shocking discovery may be a shift in understanding. The moment when the accumulated evidence reaches a tipping point and the academic consensus finally, formally, publicly acknowledges what the evidence has been suggesting for decades. That the pyramids are older than we thought, more purposeful than we thought, more sophisticated than we thought, and connected to a history of human civilization that extends further back into time than any of our current models allow. That moment is coming. It may already be underway, in the papers being written and the data being analyzed and the conversations happening in universities and research centers around the world right now. It will not arrive with a single dramatic announcement. It will arrive, as most scientific revolutions do, incrementally, one confirmed anomaly at a time, one published paper at a time, one retracted certainty at a time, until the day when the new understanding is simply there, so well supported that resistance to it becomes untenable. When that day comes, and it will come, we will look back at this period as the turning point, as the moment when the question of why the pyramids were built stopped being a puzzle for amateurs and fringe thinkers and became the most important open question in the history of the study of human civilization. As the moment when we stopped assuming we understood the past and started actually learning it. The pyramids have been waiting for this moment for a very long time. They were built to wait. They were built to last until the right questions were being asked and the right tools were available to find the answers. And now, perhaps for the first time since the ancient priests who guarded their secrets finally passed away and took their intimate knowledge with them, we are close to being ready. The horizon is there. The stone is speaking. For the first time in thousands of years, we might finally be ready to listen. There is a phrase that researchers sometimes use when they are close to a major discovery, close enough to feel it, but not yet close enough to grasp it. They say they can see the shape of something. Not the thing itself, but the outline, the shadow it casts, the way the surrounding evidence bends toward it as light bends around a massive object. That is where we are with the pyramids. We can see the shape of the answer. We can see the dimensions of what we do not yet know but are about to find out. And what we can see of that shape is magnificent. It is the shape of a civilization that understood time differently than we do, not as a line stretching forward into an open future, but as a cycle, as a spiral, as a pattern that returns and repeats, in which catastrophe and rebuilding and catastrophe again are not anomalies, but the fundamental rhythm of human existence on this planet. A civilization that had seen the cycle turn before, that had lived through a catastrophe so total that everything built before it was lost, and that responded to that loss not with despair, but with an act of extraordinary ambition. The creation of something so permanent, so precisely engineered, so deeply encoded with what they knew, that no future catastrophe would be able to erase it completely. They built the pyramids so that when the next civilization arose, as they knew it would, because they understood the cycle, it would find them and study them and eventually read them. And reading them, it would understand. You are not the first. There were others before you, as sophisticated as you or more so. They are gone, but what they knew is here in this stone, waiting for you to have the eyes to see it. We have those eyes now. We have the instruments and the mathematics and the patience and increasingly the willingness to look without prejudice. The answer to why the pyramids were built is not a single answer. It is a symphony of answers, each one complementary, each one part of a larger whole. Astronomical observatories, acoustic initiation chambers, geodetic monuments, electromagnetic resonators, encoded archives of pre-catastrophe knowledge, messages across time, markers pointing at a history we had lost and are only now beginning to recover. The shock is not that we are about to discover something new. The shock is that the answer has been there all along, in the alignment, in the mathematics, in the geology, in the texts, in the stories that every ancient culture tells about a lost golden age and a catastrophe and a rebuilding. The shock is that we have been standing in front of the greatest message in human history for 200 years of modern Egyptology, and we have been reading it as a tomb. It is not a tomb. It is a letter. And we are finally, after all this time, beginning to learn how to read it. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands on the plateau above Cairo, as it has stood for thousands of years, facing north with impossible precision, its proportions encoding the mathematics of the universe, its shafts pointing at the stars, its chambers tuned to the resonance of stone and sound, and whatever transformative experience its builders intended. It has outlasted every civilization that has ever looked up at it. It will outlast us too if we are not careful, if we do not do the work of understanding, if we do not take seriously the possibility that the people who built it were trying to tell us something that we urgently need to hear. Look at it again. Look at it the way you would look at a message from someone you had never met but who had gone to extraordinary lengths to get a letter to you across an impossible distance of time. Look at it with the respect that 4.5 million tons of precise stone, or 10,000 years of astronomical knowledge and human ambition deserves. Look at it and ask, not as a tourist or a student reciting received information, but as someone genuinely trying to understand. What are you for? The pyramid has been asking that question of every civilization that has ever found it. We are the first civilization with the tools to answer. That is not a small thing. That is, perhaps, exactly what was intended. The secret behind why the pyramids were built is not one secret. It is a nested series of revelations, each one more profound than the last, each one revealing another layer of purpose and meaning beneath the layer we just uncovered. And we are in the middle of that process right now. Not at the beginning. We have come a long way from the crude 19th century stories about slave labor and megalomaniac pharaohs. But not at the end either. The end, the full understanding of what was encoded in this stone, and why, and by whom, and from how far back in the human story, lies ahead of us. Just around the corner. Just past the next discovery. The horizon is right there, and we are walking toward it. But I want to be precise about something before we close, because precision matters in this investigation more than it does in almost any other. The claim that we are on the verge of a shocking discovery is not wishful thinking or hype. It is a description of the current state of a scientific process that has been building for decades, and that is now accelerating. Let me lay out specifically why I believe the next 5 to 10 years will be transformative for our understanding of the pyramids and of ancient civilization more broadly. First, the Scan Pyramids project is not finished. The muon tomography survey that found the large void above the Grand Gallery in 2017 used relatively low-resolution detectors. New generations of muon detectors being developed for particle physics experiments are orders of magnitude more sensitive, and plans exist to deploy them at Giza to map the interior of the pyramid with far greater precision. When this happens, and it is a question of when, not if, we will have a complete three-dimensional map of the pyramid's interior. Every chamber, every passage, every void, every anomaly in the stone. If there are spaces we do not know about and the preliminary evidence strongly suggests there are, we will find them. And finding them will force a reckoning with everything we thought we knew about what the pyramid contains, and therefore what it was for. Second, the Egyptian authorities have become significantly more open to collaborative international scientific investigation in recent years. The political and institutional barriers that kept non-Egyptian researchers at arm's length for decades have not dissolved, but they have softened. The Egyptian government has a genuine interest in understanding its own heritage fully, and it has increasingly sophisticated scientific infrastructure of its own to bring to the investigation. The combination of greater openness and greater local scientific capacity creates conditions for the kind of sustained, large-scale, multidisciplinary investigation that the pyramid's complexity demands. Third, the dating revolution in archaeology is far from over. Radiocarbon dating, which provided the initial scientific basis for the conventional chronology of the pyramids, has significant uncertainties at the scale of hundreds to thousands of years. Newer dating methods, including luminescence dating, which measures the last time individual mineral grains were exposed to light or heat, and cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measures how long rock surfaces have been exposed to cosmic radiation, can provide independent checks on the conventional dates and may reveal discrepancies that force a revision of the timeline. These methods have not yet been systematically applied to the Giza monuments with the rigor and completeness that modern techniques allow. When they are, the results will either confirm the conventional dating, which would be important confirmation, or they will not, which would be even more important. Fourth, the landscape around Giza is still largely unexcavated. The plateau itself has been intensively studied, but the broader region, including the desert to the west and south, areas beneath modern Cairo, and the eastern bank of the Nile, contains almost certainly significant archaeological material that has never been investigated. Remote sensing surveys using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have already identified numerous anomalies in these areas that are consistent with buried structures. As Egyptian archaeological authorities continue to expand their survey coverage, the known footprint of Old Kingdom and pre-Old Kingdom activity in the region will expand. The pyramids did not exist in isolation. They were part of a complex of religious, administrative, and residential infrastructure, and that infrastructure is still out there, buried under sand and modern construction, waiting to be found. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the intellectual climate is changing. The generation of archaeologists and Egyptologists who are now in mid-career, those who were students in the 1990s and 2000, when the debates about the Sphinx's age and the astronomical alignments were at their most heated, is more open to revisiting foundational assumptions than the generation that preceded them. The culture of science has shifted toward greater appreciation of anomalous data, greater willingness to publish challenges to consensus, and greater capacity for the kind of public discourse about alternative hypotheses that would have been professionally dangerous a generation ago. This does not mean that fringe speculation has become accepted. The threshold for evidence remains high, as it should. But the threshold for serious engagement with unresolved questions has lowered, and the quality of that engagement has improved. All of this means that the next decade of research on the pyramids will be more productive, more revelatory, and more potentially transformative than any equivalent period since the great age of Egyptian archaeology in the 19th century. We are not winding down the investigation of the pyramids. We are ramping it up with better tools and, crucially, with more honest questions. The honest questions are the ones that have always been there, waiting to be taken seriously. Why are the chambers empty? Why is there no body? Why are the proportions encoded with such mathematical precision? Why are the acoustic properties so specific? Why does the weathering on the Sphinx indicate an age far greater than the conventional chronology allows? Why do the ancient Egyptians' own texts speak of a first time thousands of years before the conventional origin of their civilization? Why does every ancient culture that left records speak of a catastrophe and a rebuilding and a preservation of knowledge from the time before? Why did the builders of the pyramid choose to encode their knowledge in permanent stone, rather than in the fragile media that all ancient texts have been passed down through? Why is the pyramid, of all the structures in human history, the one thing we can look at and say with confidence, this was built to last forever? The honest answer to all of these questions is, we do not fully know, and the conventional explanations are inadequate. And that is exactly the right position to be in if you want to make a genuine discovery. Because discovery does not happen when you know the answer. Discovery happens when you are honest enough to admit you do not, and curious enough to keep looking until you find it. The pyramids have been asking us to be that honest and that curious for a very long time. For most of the modern era, we have not been, at least not officially, not institutionally. But that is changing. The honesty is catching up. The curiosity is deepening. And the discoveries, the real discoveries, not the incremental refinements of a settled understanding, but the genuine paradigm shifts that change everything, are on their way. When they arrive, we will understand not just the pyramids but ourselves, our full depth of time on this planet, our full range of achievement and loss, our full story. Not the story that begins 5,000 years ago with writing and bronze and city-states, but the much longer and stranger and more beautiful story that begins whenever the first human being looked up at the stars and decided to understand them. That story has been waiting in the stone all along. The stone is speaking. Can you hear it? This is not the end of the story of the pyramids. This is the beginning of finally understanding it. And I would not be anywhere else in the world right now than standing on this threshold, looking out at the horizon that the ancient Egyptians built for us to find. There is one more thing I want to say, and it concerns us, the audience for this investigation, the people who have stayed with this long enough to arrive at this point. There is a reason you are still here. It is not because you were waiting to be told the official consensus. You already know the official consensus. You have heard it in school, read it in textbooks, seen it in documentaries. You are here because the official consensus never quite satisfied you. Because there was always something about the pyramids, something in the sheer scale of them, in the perfection of them, in the silence of those empty chambers, that made you feel like the standard story was leaving something out. That feeling is not naivety. It is not susceptibility to conspiracy theories or wishful thinking. It is the appropriate response of an intelligent mind to a genuine anomaly. Anomalies are important. They are the points where our maps of reality fail to match the territory, and those mismatches are where discovery lives. The great anomaly of the pyramids, the fact that they are too perfect, too precisely aligned, too acoustically tuned, too mathematically encoded to be explained by the simple story we have been telling, has been nagging at careful observers for centuries. The nagging has been productive. It has driven the research that has produced the muon tomography and the acoustic analysis and the geological surveys and the papyrus discoveries that are now collectively reshaping our understanding. Your curiosity, the curiosity that brought you here and kept you reading, is part of that same productive nagging. It is the same impulse that drove Skok to look at the weathering patterns on the Sphinx and refuse to accept an implausible explanation. The same impulse that drove Bovell to line up the pyramids against the stars and see if they matched. The same impulse that drove the Scan Pyramids team to aim their cosmic ray detectors at 4,000-year-old stone and ask what was inside. That impulse is, in a real sense, what the builders of the pyramid were counting on. They built something that would provoke exactly this kind of relentless curiosity, this refusal to accept easy answers, this determination to understand. They built something that would make people like you and like me, and like the researchers working on this right now, keep looking, keep asking, keep pushing toward the truth even when the institutions and the textbooks said there was nothing left to find. They knew, whoever they were from however far back in the human story, that the right question, asked persistently enough by enough people over enough time, would eventually produce the right answer. The question is why the pyramids were built. The answer is coming. The evidence is assembling. The tools are ready. The minds are open. And in the spaces between what we have already found and what we have not yet discovered, in the sealed void above the Grand Gallery, in the unexplored tunnels beneath the plateau, in the unanalyzed papyri still in the sand, in the data from the next generation of muon detectors, in the reinterpretations of known texts through new conceptual frameworks, the full answer waits. It was always going to be found eventually. The pyramid was built to be found, and the answer was built into the pyramid. The only question was when the civilization that inherited the earth after the catastrophe would finally be ready to read what had been written in stone for them. Whether we are ready is something only the next generation of discoveries will fully reveal, but the evidence suggests we might be. The tools are here. The curiosity is here. The humility is, at last, beginning to arrive. Stand in front of the Great Pyramid and look up at it, not with the eyes of a tourist ticking off a landmark, not with the eyes of a student reciting received knowledge, with the eyes of someone who does not know the answer and wants to, with the eyes of someone who recognizes that this structure is larger than any category we have tried to put it in, larger than tomb, larger than monument, larger than temple, larger than machine, larger than archive, larger even than message. It is all of these things, and possibly more that we have not yet thought to look for. The stone is patient. It has been waiting 4,500 years, or perhaps 10,000 years, or perhaps longer still. It will wait a little longer, but not much longer, because we are finally, after all this time, asking the right questions with the right tools in the right spirit. And the answer, when it comes, and it will come, will be worth every year of waiting. For us, and perhaps in some way we cannot yet fully understand, for the people who built the question into the stone in the first place.